Okay, now we enter part 3 on this conference here called the Cosmic Summit, and one speaker in particular, Dr. Martin B. Sweatman, showing, well, connections all across the ancient world and through large points of time. Where the last video ended was about these handbags here, and right before that was about the Master of Beasts concept that we have in ancient Sumer, in earliest Egypt, and all around the Fertile Crescent and beyond. And here we're seeing in Iran, in the 4th and 3rd millennium BC, a handbag that is showing Master of Beast concepts, but also he's holding back not 2 lions, but 2 leopards, it appears, and then on either side of those are scorpions. So this is actual zodiacal date using Greek zodiacs, and it corresponds with the time that we're looking at exactly. So that's another connection, but let's continue on from here. You know, a lot of it's said about these handbags over many generations. One thing a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of these are the exact same weight too, and that a lot of them were looking like they were going to be the standards of weights. And you can find some of them that have been shaved just a little bit in the handle or in other areas that help to facilitate that happening. It was in the 19th century whenever people finally took some of these things, or this past century here, and started measuring the weight on them. Oddly, they didn't have the weight on any of them. And from my understanding, out of the first 12 or so that they had to weigh, 10 of those had the exact same weight as each other, within a gram or 2, which is really remarkable. But the other 2 that were shown were actually 1/3 or 2/3 of the original amount that the other 10 were, and the other one was 3/4, giving you a differential too. I believe after this point others were measured and so on. Again, I have to point out this one here down the bottom left, where it actually shows 2 snakes coming together, something that if you ever watch the Conan mysteries and Conan movies, you could easily understand. But now we're getting on to another point here in his conference and talking about these handbags and their connections with zodiacal terms, because on the left here, that's the Uruk vase, known from being 4th millennium BC, a well-made vase that's showing here. But in the process, you can see 2 things that almost look like a spaceship on a cross or something like that. And above those, what are they corresponding to? Well, Leo the lion, and then something that looks like a goat or an ibex type creature. Well, that's Aries. Now we have Leo and Aries shown in this. And then that is also consistent with the zodiacal date of 3500 to 2000 BC. So over and over connections keep being made. Have to mention here that this thing that looks like an upside down eyeball somewhat are the original pictographs, and these others are too, with a fish and a bird. And over time they got changed. They started being written sideways. Then they got taken into cuneiform and something that kind of looks like its original photograph, done in cuneiform writing. But then by the time we get to the Assyrians, or the end of the Babylonians and into Assyria, they don't really even look anything like themselves. Which this is the symbol for sun or day. This is the one for fish and the one for birds. So that shows a connection there too that's different. And the symbology here that looks like an eye is really the sun setting between a certain niche in the ground, or between 2 mountains, or so on. So this idea has been around a long, long time. And we can still see it today in some of these artifacts. And I'm thinking that the more that we look into this connections with archaeoastronomy, we're going to find that a lot of these sites were built on that same idea. The distance from this to that is going to be the same. it's going to show up a sacred geometry number. They apparently did this on purpose, if you will. And more than on purpose, but as the reason for the sizing of everything. You know, Protagoras said that man is the measure of all things, and we can see simple things like the measure of the inch to 12 inches being a foot, but nobody's foot's usually that big. What does that have to do with everything? Well, that's just a small increment of what we know of as a man's pace, which is 5.28 feet. And if we take that mill idea, which is the reason we have the word for a mile being 1,000 paces, that's just expanded up to a larger and larger number. And we still use that idea today, figuring out how far away planets are and things like that. And it's amazing. The ancients used to have numbers that went along with certain planets, and they correlate to this same sacred geometry. So while you're taught as a kid that, oh, they had UGG going on and then they started farming, it's like, no, there was a lot more going on than that in any way, shape, or form. Darnell and Darnell, there's a couple here that were doing excavations here. They found a bird symbol in earliest Egypt here, by the way, pre-dynastic Egypt. And it's evidence for the Scorpion King at 3200 BC or slightly earlier, perhaps up to 3500 BC, maybe 36. Every symbol in this on the left is consistent with that zodiacal date. Using Gobekli Tepe zodiac and Ibex equaling Aquarius, we can see that fact. What else are we seeing here? Well, there's Scorpio that's just below a bird like Horus that's shown here. Here we see birds that are much like the bird that makes up Thoth, or the Ibex. But they say that this right here is Orion, or Osiris as we know of him from the Egyptians. And he's surrounded and headed up by other birds that are shown here. One bird carrying a branch, so like an olive tree situation that you think of Noah's Ark and so on. And people have tried to guess what this thing is. They say it's either a bench or it may be a boat. And I'm willing to agree with you that the man that drew this wasn't really that great. He wasn't the Da Vinci of the times. Quite often that's the problem with some of these artistic representations, is the guy wasn't as good as this other guy. And when you find that guy that's got that extra snap, you can easily see it and you're like, wow. Like in a lot of early cave paintings that I've shown. Or is that a spaceship? Or is that really the crab of Cancer? It could be a lot of things. So down here we actually see this is Orion again also, and he's got a prominent belt on him, and in front of him something that looks like a cattle. So this is shown again and again and again. And so he's making correlations to the fact that, not just in one place, not just in two, but as we look at it, what we find are connections to the ancient zodiac, and really going about and consistent with the time that they're talking about, as opposed to something other than that time, or a time lost and past. And again, if we look at the symbology here that's on pillar 43 with the vulture holding up the sun and so on like that, that correlates to spring, summer, and fall, or Virgo, Sagittarius, Pisces, and Aquarius, that are actually mimicked on the top of this. And the one they're missing is Cygnus, and there it is. I've also explained here on the last video how these up and down marks right here are 15 and 14, leaving 29, telling you they're working off a lunar calendar. And then these blocks here are 12 of them, saying that's what it takes to make up a whole year. But hold on, just like a mathematical problem, you put a line down and then below that you figure out the remainder. The remainder is supposed to be 11 days. But we're seeing here that this is one short. 11 is one short of 12, of course, too. But where are the V's at that make that up? Did one get smeared off? No, the answer is Cygnus himself wearing a Star Trek shirt with a V collar. is that extra one that's missing, showing you that there's something correlating to a Day of the Dead and a situation that goes back to this, which a lot of people believe this is the moniker showing you when the event of the Younger Dryas had happened. So a correlation to that also, and it's again consistent with that same thing. Now let's go to Catalhoyuk just shortly after all of these Gobekli Tepe and Tastapeller sites. Now it's up here in the top left-hand corner, just out of shot. You can see where it's circled at, but it's not too far away from Gobekli Tepe and these other places here. It's found in ancient Anatolia, and we've looked at that before. The people's houses are all built together, and there is sure civilization going on, agronomy and all kinds of things. But if you'll look, they have representations of a bear rug. They have representations of a lion or a leopard here. They have representations of a bear right above the mantelpiece, like somebody would think of if you went bear hunting and you got that. It actually looks like a bear rug stuck up on the wall. And of course, Taurus here also. And those are the major iconography that are shown all throughout Catalhoyuk. And it seems that like it's pinned around on Taurus and so on. But what about that bear? It seems a little bit different, although we just talked about the Big Dipper and Little Dipper being mama and baby bear and so on. Can we find that? Well, right there in Catalhoyuk on those handbags, the third one over, is the sign of a bear rug. And we find it another site in Gobekli Tepe, that same situation in iconography. Well, in Catalhoyuk, we see one right here. You can tell it's been swathed with a red ochre type paint, and it has a double circle as its middle belly button, recreating and saying the sun. So there's another connection there. And even this other one here, showing actually a bear's head hooked up to it, but having that same splayed out bear rug thing. If you've ever seen a bear rug, that's kind of how they look, laid out on the ground and stuff, right? So there's a connection with that too, and showing you Catalhoyuk had stuff going on as well as Gobekli Tepe not too much later. So we start inching towards a more common and modern time whenever we look at things like that. But did they have a Lunar-Solar calendar going along with that too? Well, it appears so. And in fact, when we look at this, here's that lunar cycle I was telling you about before. For in that, there are 15 and 14 sections, which is 29 days. And now we look at that stick, or that spear that was done before, and it has 15 notches on one side and 14 right next to it, showing you the same connective that early hunter-gatherers had way back when. So this is not something new that popped up like popcorn. You see, when I was a kid, they talked about, oh, Sumeria just popped up like popcorn, and then Egypt, and and they all popped up like popcorn. Well, it didn't happen that way. And through archaeological finds we're looking at, we can see it going way back, but it petered out. And honestly, all was lost until one day somebody found up under this little bump in the ground, or this little hill, there was this sacred Stonehenge type monuments that are built right here with all this zodiacal iconography, adding some 7,000 years to our current popped up like popcorn. Now, the stupidest thing we could do right now is look at this and go, well, this is when they popped up like popcorn, rather than saying this goes way back. I've shown you in cave art and things like that where they at least had a portion of this, and that's all we can really discern from that point. But those geographic markings, geometric markings that are there, having an up and down situation, I'll remind you of the Lunar-Solar calendar that founded Yazlika and the Hittites at 1600 BC, and how it worked out too. And so we have this one lunar month, or 29, or it can be counted as 30 days. So here's a flip-flop in that. But 11 lunar months means 354 days. So if we were to add and call these days here on these up and downs here, that'd be 10 more days, and we're left with one that's missing. And the one that's missing is the one that's around the throat of a vulture. No, vultures don't wear V-neck sweaters. So we have that connection there, and that makes up a 365-day year. They knew for sure that the year was 365, and there's this special date going with the death vulture, or Cygnus, and hooked up to it, and it could be signifying that this is that one date. Now, I just did a recent video showing you a death cult situation of looking like a person's having to go through that portal and head out. Where is that portal hooked up to? Well, it lines directly up with the plume of the Milky Way. That dark band that leads into the lightness of the Milky Way, almost like a boat wake in the middle of it, lines right up to that. Strangely, we find that exact iconography in the ancient Egyptians on where that barge is going to go, whenever that king's boat goes into the great beyond. And then, of course, they're supposed to be rising again by day. But that has that same iconography, the same spot, the same idea that goes along with it. So more and more connections constantly are through this thing. And I think it's just overwhelming, the amount of information they're shown. Again, enclosure D and C here, there's 11 pillars that are missing, that are here. One's missing, but then again, you can find where that one is missing right up here is actually the one that is the death throw in that building. That missing spot that's right here where I'm at is where that new find was, my new video that just came out about it. And you can find that again in enclosure C. Now, enclosure B and A do have some different iconography and amount of pillars going on to that, and we could talk about that in a separate video. But each one of these 11 pillars equals a solar year. See, there's 12 lunar months and then 11 epochal days. So is this just the 11 days that are around here? And on that extra day, there we have it. And it's the sign. Something to consider here, but again, I think this man has done incredible work. Looking at these ideas, there's 11 pillars here in Karahan Tepe, which just outside this door here is a concrete terrazzo floor, which I've showed you videos about. But they noticed here that a beam of light comes through it and marks this man's face on the summer solstice. Isn't that crazy? And then there's 11 pillars in here, which has another connection to that sign of 11. Well, isn't it 12? Well, the man is the 12th man. They also have that V-neck on Saberk Tepe in this Master of Animals, Master of Beasts iconography that's shown up here. But then we can also see him recreated here at Urfaman, who looks like a spaceman wearing a Star Trek shirt. He just doesn't have the V thing right over his chest, but he touches it and starts talking to Scotty, huh? So that's pretty interesting. But that V means a whole lot more than maybe a necklace, maybe this, maybe that. That V is just like the V's that are marking out the calendar of the year, showing you that this guy kind of has a hookup with time. So it's almost like Chronos in ancient times. So pillar 43 here, is it really a date stamp? Well, almost certainly yes. Conventional story for the origin of the Greek constellations was just a popular story based on conjecture. But now as we peer back through it, they had similar iconography going with, well, slightly different animals at different times because of what animals were around. I mean, you're not going to really get bear iconography showing up in Egypt whenever they never had any bears there in the first place, and so on. I think it's incredibly interesting. Let me know what y'all think down below, and we'll get on to another video. Peace.